So what I want to do tonight is I want to go to Luke 15, and we're going to talk about the parables in Luke 15 and then Luke 16. And this is such a teaching that shows Jesus Christ's heart for people. Because Jesus loved people, he wanted to teach people, he wanted to reach people, he wanted to evangelize people, and that's what we want to do too. And so we're just going to start, we're going to just read through the chapter, verse after verse, and see what the Lord has for us here. Now notice it starts, first of all, 15 is connected to 14, because remember in the original text there were no chapter breaks. And so in 14, there were a multitude of people following Jesus. So he's now got a multitude of people following him, and he's going to try to reach them. And it says in verse 15, or verse 1 of chapter 15, now all the tax collectors and sinners kept drawing near to him to hear him. And the word kept drawing near, if you want to get technical, I know there's some technical people in the audience here, present tense, active voice, verb, meaning it's a continual action. And so what's happening? Here are the tax collectors and the sinners, and they're continually being drawn to him as he's teaching. And you have to ask yourself, why would that be? Well, first of all, let's talk about tax collectors. What was it about Roman tax collectors that they were always put together with the sinners? Because, well, they were hated, yes, but why?
Because they took your money.
Well, they took your money, but more than that. You see, what Rome did is, like, for example, Rome would come to this area. Peter, does this area have a name besides Rochester, like a county or something? It's Walworth?
Yeah.
Okay, so the Roman government would come to Walworth, and they'd look at all the houses, and they'd look at how wealthy you people are, and they'd say, okay, we think we can get $20,000 a year into the Roman government out of Walworth. And so then they would put this up for bid to the tax collectors in Walworth. And one tax collector would say, I can get you 25. And another would say, I can get you 30. And another would say, I can get you 35. And so, but they had to watch, because if they said a number, they had to get that number. But then how would they get that money? Well, they would extort it, and they used the force of the Roman soldiers. And they would go and they would extort the money from people, which is why when the tax collectors came to John the Baptist and said, what should we do? He said, don't extort money. Because that's what they were doing. Basically, they were stealing. So what they did is they made enough, whoops, that was interesting. They made enough to pay Rome, but then any extra they got, they kept for themselves. And so that's how they got wealthy, because they used the force of Rome to extract money. They were dishonest, and they were Jews that worked for the Roman government. So they were hated, and they were combined with the sinners because they were sinners. So the tax collectors and sinners. So the question then becomes, these are generally the type of people that run away from religious people. They are. I mean, they obviously ran away from the scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees. So why didn't they run away from Jesus? And it wasn't just because he did miracles. Did he do miracles? Yes, he did. Did he do healings? Yes, he did. But what would that mean? That would mean people would come, get their healing, and leave. But they stuck around, and they kept coming. And why would they keep coming? And when you read the way Jesus Christ talks to them, teaches them, it's because he gives them a hope. It's because he assigns them value. He tells them they are worth it. Now he's going to tell them, if you read the stuff, he's going to eventually get around to saying, if you really want to please God, then you ought to try to live this way. But he couches it in such a way that he gives people a hope, and he makes them feel valued. He's not like, well, look at you, you're a mess. Let's see what we can do to clean you up. He didn't set a distance between people, and that then sets a great example for you and I. I see people that are different than me. Lots of people are different from me. I'm kind of the quintessential nerd. I don't have a tattoo. I don't have pierced ears. I don't have blue hair or anything like that. I just look like a nerd. and I have a pencil in my pocket. This is actually a pen. But anyway, so there. you know, it's easy for me to find people that aren't like me. That's pretty easy. And if I'm going to talk to those people, I can't point out our differences. And I can't tell them what they're doing that's not pleasing God. Because all they're going to do is they're going to treat me like they treat the scribes and the Pharisees. They're just going to run. When we talk to people, we've got to set before them a hope. We've got to give them value and tell them how much they're worth. And that's where Jesus is going to go. And because he's doing this, all the tax collectors and sinners kept drawing near to him. Watch the antithesis, verse 2. And both the Pharisees and the experts of law kept grumbling, active voice, present tense verb. So the tax collectors and sinners keep coming, and the religious leaders who ought to be listening keep grumbling. And there's your contrast between the two groups. And so, why are they grumbling to each other? This one welcomes sinners and eats with them. So what they've done is they've artificially set a barrier between themselves and the sinners. And you guys have to clean yourselves up and become like us. This is going to come up later on in the parable. So verse 3, and he spoke to them this parable, saying, and now what he's going to do is he's going to speak 4 parables in a row. He's going to speak a parable of the lost sheep, parable of the lost coin, parable of the forgiving father, and the parable of the unwise house manager. The first 2 parables, parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the lost coin, are about how much God values us and how hard God is working to reach us. Then the parable of the forgiving father and the parable of the wise house manager are about, okay, God's trying to reach you. What do you need to do on your part? And if we put these 4 parables together, then we can see the logic of where Christ is going with this. So the first thing he says, verse 4, what man among you having 100 sheep and having lost one of them does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that's lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost. I tell you that in the same way there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who have no need of repentance. Now let's take a second and unpack this parable a second. You've got 100 sheep. One of them gets lost. You leave the 99 in the wilderness to go wander off and look for the one sheep. Would anybody actually do that? No, they wouldn't. Why?
Because the 99 would wander off.
Yeah, that would be the least of his worries. But actually, the wolves would come and eat the 99. The thieves would come and steal the 99. So why didn't the people in Christ's audience scream foul? Why didn't they just say, this is stupid, this parable? This is where, if we understand the biblical culture, then we understand that what Christ is saying is in a context. The context is nobody watches over 100 sheep by themselves. Even if you remember on the night of Christ's birth, who was in the fields watching the sheep? Shepherds, plural. Because if you're going to, what's after sheep? Hungry people, because they'd love to steal a sheep and run off and eat your sheep. And also the wolves and the coyotes and the other things, plus other sheep that wander off. And so you've got to have somebody awake during the day and awake at night. It's a 24/7 job. In fact, shepherds were considered the dregs of society by the religious people because they worked on the Sabbath. Well, they had to, because the sheep needed to be cared for on the Sabbath. So what everybody in the culture knew, but what Christ didn't need to say, was that when the guy went off to find the one, the 99 were left with other caretakers. But because he spoke about which one of you having 100 sheep, so it's the shepherd, it's the chief shepherd, it's the guy who owns the sheep. And in parables like this, that guy is God. In parables of the kingdom, the king is God. In parables of the wedding feast, the guy who throws the feast is God. In the parable of the landholder is God. Christ taught parables in such a way that the top person was God. And so this guy who owns the sheep is God, and he's lost one of them, and he leaves the 99 with his hired hands, which is in our world, the pastors and the people like that. And he goes after the one that was lost. And what does this tell you about God and his love for people? In other words, here you are, you're a tax collector, you're a sinner, and you're hearing this parable. What are you hearing?
You are important.
You're hearing that I'm the sheep that's lost. These guys over here, they're the ones that are doing okay, but I'm not doing okay. And God is looking for me, and God is going to find me, and God is going to bring me home. And furthermore, then it says that when he comes home with you, there'll be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who have no need of repentance. Now, when he says that, again, we've got to understand the culture. Does that mean that God is looking over at the righteous people going, you don't matter? No. The righteous people, they're the ones that have been faithful. God is blessed with them. God is proud of them. But when somebody comes back, there's the surprise and the joy of that one thing. He's talking about a momentary joy of, wow, this guy has returned. And we've all experienced that. You know, like if I was one of 4 kids, you know, if one of us 4 kids kind of wandered off in the mall and the rest stuck by mom, when mom found the one, she was super excited. It wasn't that she loved them more than us. It was just she was super excited about the one. And that's what's going on here, and we've got to see that. It's not saying, oh, I've been righteous, I've been faithful, and God doesn't like me anymore. God doesn't really care about me anymore. He'd like me better if I got lost and came back. That's not what this is saying, okay? So we've got to get this. So in the parable of the lost sheep, you're valued. You know, if you're lost, if you're out there, you're valued. God is looking for you. Then go to the parable of the lost coin, verse 8. Or what woman who has 10 drachmas? Now a drachma is a day's wage. The Roman drachma is equivalent to the Greek denarius. It was a singular coin. The Roman drachma was a singular coin. The Greek denarius was a singular coin, and it was worth a day's wage for a field worker or a soldier. So you figure if it would be today, maybe it's 15, 20 bucks an hour times a 10 or 12. I can remember they didn't work, you know, like 5 o'clock, quit. They quit when the sun went down. So they're gonna work through the whole day, and whatever you'd make in a day, that was what your denarius was or your drachma was. So this lady's lost a fair amount of money, considering there wasn't a lot of money in that culture. So she loses one. She has 10. She loses one. What does she do? Well, I've still got 9. Heck with that. No. It says she lights a lamp, she sweeps the house, and seeks diligently until she finds it. When she has found it, she calls together her friends and her neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the drachma that I had lost." In the same way, I tell you, there's more joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner. There is joy in the presence of God. And there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So here again, there's an emphasis here of how much God is searching for us. When we get lost, God lights his lamps up, he's sweeping the house, he's looking for us. And Christ is talking to these tax collectors, these sinners who are the outcasts of society. They may not even be welcome in the synagogues. And all of a sudden Christ is saying, I want to tell you how much you're worth. And God is looking for you. And that's why the tax collectors and sinners kept coming. Because I guarantee you, the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, they weren't talking like this to those people. You know, and if you remember when Christ was at a dinner at the Pharisee's house, and the prostitute came in and she started to cry and wash his feet with her tears, and the Pharisee says, you know, if this man was really a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this woman is. You know, and that's how they felt about people. And no wonder those people didn't come around. And then Christ looks at her and says, your faith has made you whole. And he reaches out to her with a heart of love and a heart of gold, and he tells her that she's worth something. And then she comes to him and becomes a follower. This is what we're supposed to do. But then, okay, so now I know that I'm worth something. Now I know that God is looking for me. Well, I've got to do something. And so here we now go to the parable of the forgiving father. Now, the parables, most of the parables in the Bible don't have names. The parable of the sower is given that name in the Bible. But most of the parables are just Christ talking about a parable, and so somebody has to name it. It's typically called the parable of the prodigal son. That's not a good name at all, because it's about both sons. Linsky, who's a Bible scholar of the first rank, says this should be called the parable of the two lost sons, because they were both lost. That's not a bad title. I like that title. And so, you've got, whoops, thank you, Jeff. So we've got to give we've got to give the parable the title. I think parable of the forgiving father is certainly okay, or maybe the parable of the loving father or something like that. So he said, a certain man had two sons. Okay, who's the man? God, right. Here is God, and he's got two sons. Now here's Jesus, and he's looking at these tax collectors and sinners, and he's looking at the scribes, the Pharisees, and whatever. Now, it's not that this group is lost, they've been rejected by society, and he's trying to reach out to them, but this group is lost. They have rejected society. They have been rejected by society as a reaction to the fact that they rejected society first. But God loves them just as much as he loves this group over here. And this is one of the astounding things to me, and why I admire church ministers so much. Because if you're running a brick and mortar church and you think about it, you've got people that have been sitting in those pews for 20 years. And they come to church to get fed. They come to church to get bolstered for the week. They come to church to learn something. And they'd like to know the Bible, and they'd like to be fed meat. And the pastor is trying to think about how he can take care of the hearts of those people. And yet at the same time, you got a guy that's a drug addict and a drunk, and he comes walking in off the street, and he doesn't have a clue about anything. And here's this pastor that somehow or other has to figure out how I'm going to reach both groups. And a good pastor is faithful Sunday after Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. And they stand there and they prepare those teachings and they pray. And they're our brothers and sisters, and they need our help and our support. And I admire those guys so much for what they do. The men and women that do that are just amazing. And this is what Christ's problem is right now. He's got two groups, and they don't even like each other. They're totally opposed to each other. These guys think they're unredeemable. These guys think they don't need to be redeemed. And you're going to, you put yourself in Christ's position. He's like, what am I going to do here? And so he talks about a man, God, who has two sons. And there they both are. And he says, a certain man had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of the property that's coming to me. And he divided to them his living. A lot in here, let's unpack it. First of all, for the younger son to say, Father, give me the portion of the property that's coming to me, it's naive, it's arrogant, because it's not coming to him. Proverbs says, if you trouble your household, you'll inherit the wind. If he is a terrible son, he's not going to get any inheritance at all. There's no verse of Scripture that says parents have to give an inheritance to their children. That says that if you're a good child, you're likely to get an inheritance. But the fact that he would say, well, it's coming to me. He's young, he's arrogant, he's naive, and he's making demands on his father like his father was dead. And this is where this kind of stretches reality, because typically in an Oriental household at this point, the father would tell him to get lost. But instead, now watch this, it said, and he divided to them his living. Who's the them? The two sons. Okay, now this becomes very important. It's going to show up later in the parable. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 21. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 15, if a man has two wives, the one beloved and the other hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and if the firstborn son be hers who was hated, in other words, the son of the hated wife, then in the day that he causes his sons to inherit what he has, he may not make the son of the beloved the firstborn before the son of the hated, because he was actually the secondborn, who is the firstborn. But he must acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the hated, by giving him a double portion of all that he has. For he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. And in the biblical culture, if a man had two sons, and when he gave an inheritance, the older son got 66%, and the younger son got 33%. If you had three sons, the older son get 50%. The two younger sons would get 25% apiece. Now this becomes very important. Let's go back to Luke chapter 15, because it says he divided to them his living. Verse 13, and not many days after, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a far country, and there he wasted his wealth by living recklessly. And the scripture doesn't describe what the reckless living is. It's a very kind of a broad-based term in the Greek. And it could be he gambled it away. It could be he visited prostitutes. It could be he just buried it in the ground, forgot where he buried it. You know, you don't even know. All you know is he lived recklessly. That's what we know. And he wasted his wealth by living recklessly. But I want to point out a principle that's buried in here that's between the lines. And this is especially for those of you that deal with people or you're dealing with your own thoughts within yourself. Notice how in verse 12, the younger son, younger of them, said to his father, "Give me the portion of the property that's coming to me." What's he doing here? In his head, he's divided from the family. In his head, he's left. You know, he wants his father's money. He wants it now. And the fact that his father is living off that money, I mean, that's his father's stuff. You know, all of a sudden that doesn't matter to him anymore. And what you see here is he's separated himself from his family in his head. The next verse, it says, not many days after, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a far country. So now he leaves the family physically. So what you see buried in the word is this beautiful pastoral principle that, generally speaking, what happens with people is they leave a situation mentally and then they leave a situation physically. You know, this happens with couples in divorce. Generally speaking, the person, the spouse that asks for the divorce has left in their mind a long time before. So they leave in their mind, and then months later, they leave in their bodies. And this is an interesting principle in life, because what we want to do as Christians is catch ourselves if we find ourselves leaving in our mind. Because there's all kinds of things you can leave. You can leave your spouse, you can leave your family, you can leave your church. There's all kinds of things you can leave. And so you have to make a judgment call when you start having thoughts about, I don't like this group anymore, I don't like this guy anymore, I don't like whatever it is, and you start having those thoughts, that you can catch yourself and do an examination. Sometimes it's a good thing to leave, and it promotes growth or something in your life. But there's a lot of times where it's just a result of anger or bitterness, some kind of residual problem. And in that kind of case, you need to be honest and have a pastor or a counselor or some friend that you can talk to and say, I've had this happen in my life, and now I'm having thoughts about, I'm out of here, I'm done. And I'm not sure that they're godly or not. And do what Proverbs says and get a multitude of counselors behind you to make sure that you're thinking straight before you do something stupid like this guy. So anyway, he leaves. He goes off and goes into a far country, and he wasted his wealth by living recklessly. Verse 14, and when he had spent everything, a severe famine came upon that country, and he began to be in need. And remember that we're dealing with a time period and a culture where it's almost completely agricultural. Probably 90% of the work is agricultural. It's herdsmen, people watching over flocks, people growing crops. Remember Boaz and his workers, for example, in the book of Ruth, and they're out in the fields working. And so for there to be a famine, it isn't just this guy who's in need. All of a sudden, it's kind of like in parts of the United States today where there's a help wanted sign on every store. Except it's the opposite. There's workers everywhere and nobody needs help because there's a famine. And so what it's telling you is that now not only is this guy in need because of his riotous living and his lack of wisdom, but he's going to have a hard time finding any way to support himself because everybody else is looking for a way to support themselves. And so it says, he began to be in need, verse 15, and he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And so here's the guy, and he's a Jew, but the only job he could find was to feed pigs. Now, this is degrading work if you're a Jew, because the pigs, of course, are unclean. But it's more than just degrading work. First of all, pigs stink, and they need an area to run around in and wallow in, so pigs aren't close to town. So one of the things that's happening is he's in a very asocial environment. It's not like he's got a job in town where people come by and say hello and how are you doing and blah-de-blah-de-blah. He's out by himself in the fields. So he's lonely through the day, heat of the day, cold of the night. Also, remember now there's a famine. So who's after his pigs? Yeah, hungry people, right? So now this guy is talk about, he probably never got a decent night's sleep. I mean, he's got to figure out how to keep the pigs together and watch over them during the day. He's got to guard over them at night. It's just, this is not only a degrading job, it's an amazingly difficult job, physically and mentally. And so at verse 16, and he's hungry. He was longing to be fed with the carob pods that the pigs were eating. And a human being can eat those carob pods, and you could sustain yourself for a little while, but they don't taste good, and you can't sustain yourself for long. But he's watching the pigs eat them, and I wish I could do that. And so he's hungry. And then we have this very interesting phrase here, and it says, and no one gave anything to him. And that's interesting because in both the Jewish culture and in the Greco-Roman culture, giving to the poor was considered a virtue. Now, I've read commentaries on this verse that say, well, in the Greco-Roman culture, they didn't give to the poor. They did give to the poor. If you study the Greco-Roman literature and understand how the cities were built and there were beggars everywhere and that kind of thing. So giving to the poor was considered a virtue both in the Greco-Roman world and in the Jewish world. Now, the Jewish world, very specifically, it's spelled out. The book of Proverbs says if you give to a poor person, you're lending to the Lord. Meaning that on the day of judgment, he's going to give back to you. When Paul was in jail and the Philippians sent him money, he said, I don't need your gift. I didn't want to demand your gift. I wanted fruit to abound to your account, your reward. So the Jews really codified this, that it was a really good thing and that God would pay you back. The Romans and Greeks just did it because it pleased the gods and it pleased them to help out people. So then, how come nobody's given him anything? If both the Jews and the Greco-Romans kind of took care of the poor, why wouldn't anybody give anything to him? And the answer is that they knew him. We all know people that they are constantly in need, but anytime you help them out, they just waste it. And finally, you just don't give them anything. This guy had gone into their country and he showed up, Mr. Moneybags. And he lived riotously and he spent all that he had. And so all of a sudden when he's in need, everybody, nobody's got any compassion for him. They're like, well, you idiot, you did this wrong and this wrong and this wrong, and I've got no reason to believe that you would take what I have and handle it wisely. So nobody gives anything to him. And so there he is. Verse 17, it says, but when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, enough food, but I am perishing here with hunger. Now, I think verse 17 is the chewy caramel center of this parable. Remember, what's Christ doing? This is not history. This didn't ever happen. This is a parable. And Christ is teaching it because he's got a problem. And the problem he's got is those guys and those guys. And he's going to try to reach them. He's going to try to get into their heart. And they have to make a decision that they're going to change so that they can be in the favor of God. The tax collectors and the sinners have to say, we're going to live a little more righteously. And the Pharisees and Sadducees and stuff, they have to come down off their high horse and say, wow, we need to listen to God a little more. And so this starts with, when he came to himself. And nobody really changes from their behavior until they come to themselves and say, I need to change. I need some help. What I'm doing just isn't working for me. And that's what Christ is trying to do. He's trying to reach these two groups. And so he starts out with, but when he came to himself and got humble and examined his life, then he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, and I am perishing here with hunger? So there's going to be three stages to this guy's journey, if you will, what he does for restoration. The first is he gets honest about it and gets humble, and he comes to himself. The second thing he does is makes a plan, and the third thing he does is executes the plan. So he comes to himself in verse 17. Then in verse 18, here's his plan. Now remember, he hasn't left anywhere yet. He's still feeding pigs. But look at his plan. He says, I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. And I love that, because this when he says heaven, being a Jew, it's a circumlocution for God. And he pictures himself going up to his dad and saying, Dad, I've sinned against God. Not just, I've made a bunch of mistakes, I'm not really guilty, it's somebody else's fault. I have sinned against God. And that takes real honesty and real humility. And then he says, and sinned against you. I mean, this is powerful stuff. He's genuinely broken. This is not pretend stuff. This is a parable. Christ is teaching evangelism. And he's teaching these guys, you've got to come to yourself and you've got to be humble, but you've got to have a plan. And the son says, I have sinned against God and I have sinned against you. Verse 19, I am no longer worthy to be called your son, which is correct. The Pharisees and Sadducees weren't worthy to be called God's children. Neither were the tax collectors and sinners. That's an honest evaluation. In my flesh, I am not. Are you kidding? I'm worthy to live forever? It's like, what in the world could I have possibly done to deserve that? I am simply not worthy of that honor, and to be called an ambassador for Christ and a child of God. And that's just a humble position. We don't denigrate ourselves. We just humbly understand the position that we have. And he says, I've sinned against God. I've sinned in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants. Verse 20, he executes the plan. Verse 17, he comes to himself. Verse 18 and 19, he makes his plan up. Verse 20, and he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. Now remember, this is a parable designed to evangelize. It's not history. So that the text is invented to make a point. And so the point he's making is not that Israel is a flat country. Look how far I can see. Wow! That's not the point. The point is a double entendre, that when the sun is a long way off. And what are the Pharisees going to do? See, the Pharisees are going to stand there and they're going to say, when you get circumcised, when you keep Torah, when you come a little closer this way, when you come a little closer this way, when we confirm your circumcision, when, and when you're right here like us, then you're accepted. And the sinners are never going to get there. They're never going to get there because they're never going to take those steps because they're just religious anyway. And what does the parable say? When he's a long way off, he's got a long way to go. He's not healed yet. He's not whole yet. He's still an alcoholic. He's still reckless. He's still young. He's still arrogant. He's still naive. He's a long way off from God. And what is it? It's God sees him, and then God runs to him. You see the power in that. So many people are like, my life is such a wreck. God would just never accept me. You don't get it. Yeah, you're a long way off. That's where God's looking for you. You don't need to come to God to be acceptable to God. You can be a long way off and get humble in your heart, and God comes to you. And that's the message. No wonder the sinners and the tax collectors are coming around Christ. I mean, the hope in this message is unbelievable. So while he's still a long way away, his father saw him, saw the change in his heart, was moved with compassion, ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, against God, and against you in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And at that point, his father just puts up his hand and says, I'm not hearing this. I'm not listening to this. That doesn't matter. You're here. You had a humble heart. You came back. I love you. We're done. And that's in other words, this is the teaching on evangelism. What's Christ saying? You don't need to come groveling to God to get accepted by God. You just have to say, God, I'm sorry. And he takes you back. Done. Poof. And you sit there, and I've got this problem. That God's like, we'll deal with those. Not worried about them. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for coming back. And so the father just cuts him off. And the father says to his servant, verse 22, quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand, sandals on his feet. So these are symbols of status that put him back in the family. You're part of the family again. You've got symbols of status. And then this is kind of interesting. And bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. Now, do you think like they just had fatted calves sitting around? See, the Jewish calendar was kind of like our calendar in that it was predictable. Like we know that Christmas is coming on December 25th. So somewhere around October or whatever, my wife will start thinking about where are we going to put the Christmas tree and blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah, and all those things. Well, she will. I won't, thank God. But anyway, and so, they'd know, okay, Passover is coming up in 3.5, 4 months. And, we're going to have a lot of people over. And so we can't offer a skinny cow and have a feast. So what they would do was they would know what the calendar was, when the feasts were, and they would start preparing animals and fatten them up so that they'd be nice and fat and plump and wonderful to eat when the feasts came around. So every wealthy family like this had animals in various stages of being fattened up for the coming feast. So apparently they had one that was pretty fat. The interesting thing here is what you don't see the father do, put a ring on his hand, sandals on his feet, and I wonder if he's worth like killing the fatted calf. I mean, we were saving that calf for the feast. I mean, son, feast. No, go get a chicken or two. There isn't that. It's like, what's Christ saying here? Don't worry about being so religious. Really, it's like kill the fatted calf, but we were preparing the fatted calf for Passover. It doesn't matter. My son was dead and he's alive. Bring the fatted calf. And this is such an important thing in that culture. They go, wow, he's look at what he's willing to sacrifice. Look at the joy in his heart. This is genuine, authentic joy. This is not just, kind of make-believe, I'm glad to have you home, son type of thing. Bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. Verse 23, for this my son was dead and is alive again, meaning he was dead to the family. He was dead to what he could have had, and now he's alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to celebrate. So this then takes care of the tax collectors and sinners, this group over here. They are accepted back when they were a long way off. God brought them in. He's now reinstated them into the family. Now we got these guys over here. Now they're kind of huffing and puffing about this. Remember, they kept grumbling when Christ was teaching. So he says, now his son, the older one, was in the field. Let me ask you a question. What is the older son doing in the field?
Working.
He's working. Right, and that's their whole problem. You know, if we do the right works at the right time and the right way, God will have to love us. You know, he will have to love us because we are wonderful, or whatever we are, who knows. but they had a works-based theology, and that's why they were so mad at the sinners and the tax collectors, because they weren't doing everything right. They weren't keeping the Sabbath day's journey. They weren't doing the tithe thing. They weren't, doing, and they have this works thing. And so here's Christ, and he's saying the older son, while he's in the field, he's working. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And it says, and he called one of the servants to him and inquired what these things meant. This is an area in the parable where, again, it's non-historical. Because if it was historical, as soon as the younger son came back, the father would have dispatched a servant, go get your brother because we're going to throw a party. But that wouldn't have worked for the parable. So here what he's doing is, the older son who's working in the field, trying to be righteous by his works, heard music and dancing. Verse 26, called one of the servants to him and inquired what these things meant. Verse 27, and he said to him, and what you kind of got to just push the text a little bit to see is how the tone of voice, like if you acted this out in a little TV vignette, that the servant would be excited about this. It wasn't like, well, your brother, the kind of recklessy guy, he showed up and it's like, the servant's excited. He's like, your brother has come and your father's killed the fatted calf because he's received him safe and sound. Well, that's wonderful, fantastic. Verse 28, but he became enraged and would not go in. And why not? Because the younger son didn't do it right. And in his work-based theology, so you have to do it right to be accepted. And so he won't come in. And then you see the love of the father. And his father came out and pleaded with him. And this is God. Gentlemen, God is trying to reach you in your hard-heartedness, in your religious separation. The word Sadducee comes from Sadduq, or Sadach, which is righteous. The Sadducees were the righteous ones, and the Pharisees comes from the Hebrew word Perez, which is to separate. We're the separated ones. We're not like them. We're the separated ones. So they had, even in their names, they had picked this, we're different from everybody else. And the father comes and pleads with them. Verse 29, but he answered and said to his father, look, these many years I've been serving you, and I never transgressed a commandment of yours. Really? I thought the father was a godly man. I thought the father followed Torah. What about love your neighbor? That's in there too. What about the you take care of your brother and that kind of thing. So the fact of the matter is he's saying, I never transgressed a commandment of yours. The father could say, are you joking? You're transgressing one right now. But it shows you there's a great lesson here. Overly religious people tend to be very blind to what doesn't work for them. And this is something, and when we see it in the Word, you see, then we're prepared when we see it in the world around us. That people who have a works-based theology, who think they have to do things right to be accepted by God, to be loved by God, they're mad at people that don't do things the same way they do. And so we're aware of that then, and we know that we've got to reach into that kind of heart, and we're aware that in their heart of hearts, they think they're doing things right without transgressing a commandment. And they're not, but they can't see it, and that's why we've got to have patience with those people, why we've got to try to get into the heart and not argue with them on a superficial level. I never transgressed a commandment of yours, he says in verse 29. And yet you never gave me a young goat that I could make merry with my friends. Okay, back to Deuteronomy chapter 21:17. Who owns the goat? The older son. He divided to them his living. and the older son got twice as much as the younger son. And I can see the father be completely nonplussed by what? It's your goat. What are you talking about? If you want to kill the goat and eat it, kill it and eat it. It's your goat. You know? And this is, you see, the religious people, they were trying to serve God out of their heart. They were doing it wrong. They had the wrong idea about God. But the fact of the matter is God had given them everything. God had given them love and righteousness and that kind of stuff. It's their goat. But they're so blind they don't even see it. And so he says, you haven't even given me a goat. And the father, it's your goat. So that I could make merry with my friends. And he could have done that any time he wanted to. Verse 30. But when this son of yours came, the one who's devoured your living with prostitutes, and this reveals the dark heart of the older son, because he has no reason to believe that. He just knows the younger son is back. The younger son may have come back with money. He didn't even know the younger son had come back yet. He doesn't know the state of affairs. He just knows that his father's excited that the younger son has come back, and so he's throwing a party and he's killed the fatted calf. But he says he's devoured your living with prostitutes. That comes right out of the dark heart. And we've got to recognize that. And then it says, but the one who's devoured your living with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. And what you see in here is a slight shift, because he'd been mad at the younger son. Now it turns out he's mad at the father. You made a mistake. You killed the fatted calf for him. You didn't get things right. You didn't handle the situation properly. You weren't godly in the way you handled it. And that's kind of, if we extrapolate that, it go into the mind of the scribes and Pharisees. How do they feel about the prostitutes? How do they feel about the sinners that Christ heals and anoints and hugs and accepts? And God obviously, that guy's now walking. That guy's now seeing. That person is now not lame anymore. And what are they thinking? God, you're not doing things right here. We're the ones that are working so hard and doing it right. We need all these blessings. You're not supposed to bless them. They aren't doing it right. And what's happening? You're all of a sudden you're blaming God because of your theology. And look at the blindness there. Instead of saying, okay, wait a minute, those guys are getting healed. My theology must be wrong. Instead, it's those guys are getting healed. God, what's wrong with you? And this gets shown up in the parable. That, you killed the fatted calf for him. Verse 31, and he said to them, my child, and he doesn't use the word huios, son, he uses the word teknon, child, meaning my child, my beloved one. It's a term of endearment. My child, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours, which is true. But it was right to make merry and be glad, for this one, your brother, was dead and is alive, and was lost and is found. And he's exactly, and then the parable ends, and you're like, and? Yeah, and why doesn't it tell you? Because the jury's not out on the prostitutes and the sinners. They've been coming and coming and coming. Remember, they kept coming close to hear him, to get saved, to get delivered, to get blessed. So we know they came in and got accepted. But what about the religious guys out here? We don't know. Is their heart going to break, and their hardness going to break, and their eyes going to be opened, and they're going to come to Christ? Some, like Nicodemus, did. But most of them did not. And so he leaves the parable where it is, and it's kind of like, guys, all you people that want to be righteous by your works and want to exclude others, and you want to be separate from others, and you want to be holier than others, then, you've got to, we'll pray that God will break your heart and you'll come into the party. But maybe they won't. And that's why he leaves the parable like it is. And so I close with a summary of saying, remember that this parable is about evangelism, and it teaches us how to evangelize. And sometimes we need to be as honest as the parable. There are times when you're dealing with somebody who's caught up in sin, and you've told them about how much God loves them, and you've told them how valuable they are to God. And then you've got to go the extra step and say, look, you've got to come to yourself. You've got to make a decision about whether or not you believe that. Do you believe when Christ died for you? Don't you believe that you're worth it? You know, this is where it's a pastoral walk by the Spirit. Everybody we talk to is going to be a different situation. Everybody we talk to is going to be a different challenge to get into their heart. But look at the way Christ did, and I love it. The guy came to himself, he made a plan, he executed the plan. That's a good way to go. You guys have been wonderful. God bless you very much, and thank you so much.